Stop that. I can hear it. We need to do it again.
You can hear our rock, paper,
Yes,
scissors?
you can hear the rustling.
Okay.
We literally need...
Sorry, team.
Now we gotta do it again.
Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact. And enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
It is our basic human right to be forgotten.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Occultae Veritatis.
Hello, occultists, and welcome back to Occultae Veritatis podcast. My name is Leon Filger, along with
Sage Murray.
Sagemore Demon.
Sagemore Demon.
Sage Murdyman.
And Ood, I'm here too. And guests also.
Richard Bigley.
Our guests are just looking like,
I'll be hosting this episode. I'm Don Kessler. Thank you very much for joining us.
The rest of these fuckers don't know what they're doing. They don't even know who the fuck they are.
And also,
L.E.B.
yeah.
And,
this is a kind of dodgy episode. It's kind of sad, controversial. So I've got a unique poison for us.
So, what's your poison?
I won't be consuming it, obviously, because it's alcoholic. I've got myself another Budweiser Zero. But recently, my great-uncle moved into a nursing home, and whilst I was in his condo picking up shit to bring to him at the nursing home, I found a single bottle of wine. Homemade wine, nonetheless. It's called Primo Rosso, and he made it probably a decade ago. There's no sulfites in it, so I have no idea if it is turned or not, or if it's still good. But we've all got wine glasses.
It might be just like
vinegar.
Vinegar, yeah.
Yum.
So, what's your vinegar?
You can make a nice vinaigrette with it.
Yeah, we can get some of those magic berries. Now that we know that works, and just it'll taste like wine again.
Sage, would you narrate what I'm doing?
Leon Filger is slowly cranking the duck penis-shaped apparatus into the head of the bottle. Slowly, compassionately, gently.
You can tell they've done this before.
And cranks. It is at the top. Now, they gently lower the arms of the duck pea. Oh, nice pap.
Nice pap.
Okay, so we're going to pass the bottle around here. I'm going to open my Bud Zero.
What does it smell like?
It smells like wine.
Oh,
It
that's
does
good.
not smell like
Vinegar.
outhouse or anything.
Outhouse.
I got the nicest of plastic wine glasses for this occasion.
They're pretty nice.
Is that enough?
Yeah, it's enough.
Okay, everyone take your first sip.
That tastes like wine.
It tastes like a wine, yeah.
I don't like it.
A little dry.
Can anyone else still see?
Pretty bland.
Can we mix some like cough syrup in it or something? I think that might help.
It has like a spaghetti aftertaste.
Yes, it does.
Like you chew on a piece of raw pasta and it kind of coats the inside of your mouth.
Now that you say that, yeah.
Have some hints of pear.
Liar.
Has an unctuous flavor.
Has no legs.
But you know what? For like a at least 10-year-old bottle of homemade wine, it'll do. It gets an it'll do out of excellent wine for me.
2 rot guts out of 3 rot guts.
I'll finish this glass.
He's got the homemade wine, 10 years old, no sulfates, so it might be
in his head.
That good, eh?
Might have inhaled some.
Oh no, it's in your lungs now.
Yeah, I tried to make a slurpy sip sound. And...
Should fill a bong with this and take a couple of hits.
See, that's what I thought Panda was doing.
Ah, okay.
I was thinking about it, but I thought how terrible that would probably taste in the lungs.
It might taste okay, and I think technically I'm allowed to smoke out of a wine bong. That doesn't violate my sobriety terms, does it?
I don't think so. No.
I mean, your
Fill
terms are
it
to
up.
you, my person.
Any other comments, questions, queries, concerns, statements, or outbursts about my great uncle's 10-year-old homemade wine?
Would it be disrespectful to smoke through it?
My great uncle is interesting in that about a year ago, he sent me an email saying he had unfriended me from Facebook because he saw a lot of things on Facebook he didn't like, and all of them came from me. So I went to his place and stole one of his Zippo lighters. It says "do" line on the back of it, so the distant early warning line that I'm doing an episode on in the future. So I will bring that lighter to the "do" line episode.
Uncle Frank, if you're listening, it's totally lost. We don't know where that is.
This is the kind of wine you watch Days of Our Lives while drinking.
I would tell him that we enjoyed it, but his dementia is very advanced, and he has no idea who the fuck I am.
Fair.
Oof. Good wine, though.
But will he remember the wine?
No, he definitely won't.
Our language and culture were being threatened through the education system, through the assimilation policies of the government. We were losing control of our resources and the management of our wildlife.
It's the dawn of the Cold War, and Canada wants to show the Soviet Union that our far north is inhabited.
They were moved for sovereignty purposes, and they are the human flagpoles of this country in the north.
The race to exploit the North's resources goes into high gear. Underneath this stunning landscape, billions of dollars of oil, gas, and minerals. The Inuit have almost no input, despite living here long before Canada existed.
The international oil companies all of a sudden got very interested in the Canadian Arctic, and they just came in droves. They were pretty much allowed to do whatever they wanted.
In 1953, Louis Saint Laurent strolls into his second term as Prime Minister, the same year as the High Arctic Relocation, and addresses the House of Commons on Arctic affairs. Canadian governments, he observes, have administered the North in an almost continuous state of absence of mind. By 1953, rumor has it that the American contingent in the high Arctic islands will dramatically expand.
May 8, 1953. The Arctic archipelago is the most sensitive as far as sovereignty is concerned. If all the projected U.S. developments in this area are carried through, there would be about 1,200 U.S. personnel in this part of Canada.
7 Inuit families with permanent homes in the high Arctic would strengthen Canada's hold on the region. Among those selected are an 80-year-old grandmother and a 24-year-old woman disabled by polio.
We got our first contact with the government of Canada in 1953 when the RCMP came to our small camp.
The Amagwaliks are among 87 Inuit who are moved 2,000 kilometers north to Resolute Bay. The government claims that the high Arctic relocation will be beneficial for the Inuit.
They described it in very glowing terms. They said that there were plenty of wildlife. It was completely the opposite of what we saw. It was like landing on the moon. No vegetation, very few fish. We were often hungry.
They dumped us like dogs. There was little light, and the weather was already cold. They moved us to a barren land in front of a big mountain. We didn't have any supplies. We had nothing but tents. They did give us buffalo hides, which we used to insulate our tents, but they made our tents dark. They made us live a life as though we were dogs on a long leash. When a dog touches a person's belongings, the dog is punished by being hit. It was as though we were treated like that, and when the police found out that we were scavenging for food in the garbage dump, He would search our whole house to find what we took from the dump. My father used to say, "Why is it that we are here? Why did the government place us here? They didn't assist us in anything at all, and our lifestyle got worse here." He didn't have anyone to ask. He didn't have anyone to ask these questions, so he would ask these questions to himself, and he would say, "I wonder if the government placed us here to die."
So this episode is called Cold War, Canada's High Arctic Relocation. It's July 1953. Your name is Tivia Gulakak, and you live in an Inuit village in northern Quebec, then known as Port Harrison. It's a former Hudson's Bay Company fur trading post. You live in a small but cozy home with your wife, Ellesmere, and 3 children. Life has been hard in Port Harrison, today known by its Inuk name of Inukjuak. In the 2 decades since the big company left, and unemployment skyrocketed. The caribou herds, once numerous, have been decimated by overhunting, and the vast majority of Port Harrison's 500 residents are on social assistance. The fox population, also important to hunters, is at a 4-year low. Port Harrison, which sits at the northern tip of Quebec on Hudson Bay, is in crisis, and members of the community are calling on the federal government of Liberal Prime Minister Louis Laurent to intervene with more social supports.
I was 22 years old when they relocated us. I remember that we were never hungry then. We were happy with our lives here. They told us that there will be an abundance of food in the new location and that we should try it out. They also said that we could return in about 2 years.
What I loved the most was the land. I loved to pick blueberries and cloudberries, and I also loved to collect minnows from the streams. This picture was taken when I was still living here and working for a white family. I used to work part-time for them, and I would go there whenever the woman had a lot of work to do. She would place the baby on my back and send me outside.
In those days, we did not depend entirely on the Hudson's Bay. We were living out of the land, much more than we were getting our supplies. We used to go to the Hudson's Bay store to get a flour, tea, those little things. But they were not our main food. We survived from the land. We've been surviving from the land for centuries.
When I was at home, I used to help my mother doing women's work. There were 7 children in the family, and we were all girls. Since my father had no son, as soon as I got old enough, I used to help him hunt. By the time I was 17, hunting was my way of life. It was part of who I was as a person. In those days, we had nothing to worry about because we knew this land and the land was good to us. I did everything following the ways of my mother and father.
Now, we'll return to Tivia Gulakak's story in a moment. In 1953, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was only 4 years old, and the Cold War with the Communist Soviet Union was in full swing, with the Warsaw Pact being established only a year later. During this time period, Russian bombers and surveillance aircraft made regular overflights of the high Arctic Canadian archipelago, which threatened Canadian and U.S. sovereignty over the territory. Several islands, including Ellesmere, Cornwallis, and Baffin, were targeted by the USSR as potential annexation sites should tensions with NATO continue to rise. The problem for Canada was that almost no one lived north of the distant early warning line, which is the topic of another episode. The solution, as formulated by Louis Saint Laurent's government, was to establish the communities of Resolute and Grise Fiord on Cornwallis Island and the southern tip of Ellesmere Island, respectively. But who would live in these new communities? Well, let's check back in with Tivy Agulakak and his family in Port Harrison. It's now 1953, and a government delegation has arrived in the village. The agents, members of the RCMP, traveled door to door, interviewing all residents in order to determine who would be best suited for a new housing project proposed by the newly created Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development and the Department of Resources and Development. The project, you are told by an agent, involves moving 92 Inuit from 60 families to better hunting grounds where you will be able to resume your traditional subsistence lifestyle. You are told that caribou, polar bears, and beluga whales will be plentiful, and that there will be homes at the new sites, ready to move into as soon as you arrive. The offer sounds too good to be true, but you're a man of great personal pride, and getting off social assistance and being able to once again provide for your family is too good an offer to pass up. You sign a contract with the agent, and your family is added to the relocation list. It's an exciting time, and the promise of endless game to hunt is thrilling. It's been your dream to return to subsistence living, and your dream is about to come true.
See, I have an ominous feeling already, because it seems like whenever we promise indigenous people something, we don't deliver.
Yeah, no kidding.
Because agents always bring good things.
So 2 weeks later, more government agents arrive on two large ships, an Arctic patrol vessel called the CGSS CD Howe, and an icebreaker called the CDS D'Iberville. So the CD Howe was actually named after Clarence Decatur Howe, who was the Minister of Everything under the government of William Lyon Mackenzie King during the Second World War. So he controlled everything. He was Mackenzie King's right-hand guy and was in charge of the entire war effort. So within a day of arriving in Port Harrison, 92 members of the community, including your family, are loaded onto the two ships, and they set sail for the north. The loading of ships was somewhat chaotic, and several families were split between the two ships, with those families being told they would be reunited once they reached their as-yet unknown destination.
One question.
Yeah.
The introductory letters on each of those ships, what does that stand for?
One stands for Canadian Coast Guard ship, and the other stands for Canadian Coast Guard Service ship.
What's the difference?
The plain old Coast Guard ship is an icebreaker, and the CD Howe is a maritime patrol vessel. So flashback to Louis Saint Laurent. His sinister plan, branded as a humanitarian operation to save the Port Harrison Inuit from abject poverty, was to use the Inuit as human flagpoles, asserting Canadian sovereignty over the high Arctic.
Jesus Christ.
May 8, 1953. The Arctic archipelago is the most sensitive as far as sovereignty is concerned. If all the projected U.S. developments in this area are carried through, there would be about 1,200 U.S. personnel in this part of Canada.
The efforts that the Russians have made to stake a claim to part of the Arctic seabed. Now, I understand the Russians even went down a submersible and put a Russian flag on the floor of the seabed. What, is that, first of all, is that true, and what do you make of that? Anybody jump in?
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
It's true that I did it, and I think several of us, and McKay was one of the people commenting that. We commented by saying that we used to put flags on the North and the South Pole 100 years ago, but since then we learned to send letters to the UN instead, and that's an example to follow.
Lieutenant O'Neill stated that he was afraid there was not sufficient wildlife in the Resolute area to provide for the proposed Eskimo population. Mr. Cantley replied that he had reason to believe there was sufficient marine life. No one could say for sure if this was the case, and so consequently, the experiment was being staged. Mr. Sieverts pointed out that the Canadian government is anxious to have Canadians occupying as much of the North as possible. And it appeared in many cases the Eskimos were the only people capable of doing this. Lieutenant O'Neill asked how many families would be going to each of the 3 settlement areas. Mr. Cantley stated that this would be decided on the boat, taking the Eskimos to their destination.
As we were nearing our destination, I began seeing great rivers, or so I thought, but these were great rivers of ice and melting ice. It was a land of unmelting water. We haven't been told that where we were going would be a land of ice.
They divided the families. They divided us like dogs. The women were openly crying as we were being divided up to go to 3 different places.
His agents promised the Inuit on the ships that if they didn't want to stay in the far north, they would be allowed to leave after 2 years. But this promise was never kept.
That's real upsetting.
Typical Canadian government, really.
Yeah.
You can't do stuff on this territory. We have people living there. Hey, we gotta get some people up there.
That's exactly what it was.
Jesus Christ.
We also do not recognize your sovereignty. It will be our symbol.
After a 2-week voyage, some 2,000 kilometers north of Port Harrison, the CD Howe and the d'Iberville arrive in what will be known as Resolute on Cornwallis Island. Approximately half the ship's passengers are ordered ashore, but you, Tiviagulakak, and your family are made to stay aboard the CD Howe. Other families are split up. As you look out across the passenger deck, all you can see in Resolute is an Arctic wasteland, completely devoid of vegetation. Aside from the small weather station and the beginnings of a modest Royal Canadian Air Force base, there are no buildings, not even tents, and you notice that as the other passengers disembark, they have very few possessions with them. They are left with almost nothing in the way of supplies and very little food rations. The agents issue them rifles for hunting, but that's it. Over the next winter, many of your friends will die in Resolute, either from cold or hunger.
Resolute's like real fucking north, right?
I'm coming.
Yeah, let's see what Resolute is. It's up there.
Yeah.
So here is Resolute, and here's Grise Ford. So Resolute Bay, as the crow flies to Ovpod Studios in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, is 2,565 kilometers-ish.
Wow.
Be similar for Grise Ford.
Yeah, so they're both north of the pine tree line. They're north of the tree line, and they're north of the dew line. So they're way the fuck up there, and literally no one lived there before the Inuit got dumped off.
Like you look at Greenland, and then you kind of like go halfway up Greenland, and that's where they are.
Yeah.
Except on Canada, but not in Greenland.
If you look at Greenland like a head, it's kind of like the bottom chin. It's just west of there.
One agent tells you that the next destination will be better. Grise Fiord, you're told, has plenty of game to hunt, and is surrounded by mountains that will block the most of the cold. You'll soon find out that this is a lie, one of many. As the CD Howe departs Resolute Bay for Grise Fiord, you maintain your optimism. You were a skilled caribou hunter back in Port Harrison before the famine, and you've been promised endless game as you sail northeast. 6 days later, you arrive at the southern tip of Ellesmere Island. This is Grise Fiord, and it looks even more hostile than Resolute. You were certainly not told as much at the time, but Grise Fiord is one of the coldest inhabited places on the planet, with winter lows dipping into the low -40s and summer highs almost never exceeding +10.
Wow.
This godless place is indeed surrounded by mountains, but they do nothing to block the wind coming off of the Jones Sound and Glacier Strait on Baffin Bay. The CD Howe drops anchor in Jones Sound off the coast of Ellesmere Island, and you are ordered, along with your young family and the other passengers, off the ship and onto small dinghies to make the short trip to shore. Again, the agents tell you that you'll be free to leave in 2 years if you're dissatisfied with your new home, but you're reminded that Port Harrison is a shithole and you'd be a fool to return. It wouldn't matter even if this was the case, because you've just been lied to again, and you will never leave Grise Fiord alive. The winter of 1953 and 1954 is particularly harsh, and you and 2 of your children succumb to the elements just before Christmas.
Resolute Bay Radio, Baffin 202, just on the main airport, going to be texting for Alpha, backtracking at 35 for a northern departure for Grise Fiord.
Baffin 202, roger.
You can see this place is all sheer cliffs as well. Not a lot of places where you can actually land and build a town, which is why they picked Grise Fiord where it is.
It's actually a little flat, just a little bit.
That little tiny valley there, but most of these places like really, really rough, straight from the water right to the cliff. Had the first people come up here and see this place, their heart must have sunk, because a lot of them came from the tree line. So they were from Great Whale and places like that, and this place must have just broken their hearts.
Oh yeah. Still, you still have the awesome question of why the hell would you live up here?
They were forced here, they had no choice.
Grise Fiord was forced?
They were rounded up and they were brought here. They were Told a whole load of stories, and they were basically dumped here with a load of shit. And it was 2 years before a ship came back, and when it did, half of them were dead. Just being dumped here was just a crime against humanity. Yeah, the history of that whole period is pretty violent. But the government of the 50s treated Inuit people like children. They didn't have names, they thought, so they gave all the Inuit people just a number and said, your Eskimo number, blah, blah, blah. That was the government saying they didn't understand that the Inuit not only had, you know, a first and last name, but several other names. And they couldn't make head or tail out of it, so they just gave them numbers and thought they were all savages. Very strange. Oh yeah, that history is pretty unique.
Yep.
But again, a lot of it was just pure friggin' ignorance.
Got the airport, yeah, it's about 11 o'clock.
Yep.
On the approach, over Bodbo, planning to be on the ground in about 2 minutes for runway 32.
Quick note for folks that don't know, because I know a lot of people in the States often don't know this. The word Eskimo is actually considered a slur. It's the name that like white people gave to the peoples of the North.
Yeah, it means eaters of raw meat.
Yeah, which is not the nicest way to refer to someone, and it's not their name. It'd be like just calling someone whatever you want. The peoples of the North generally go by whichever name they go by. Lots of them in Canada are Inuit. There's also Inuk. There's also Alouettes.
Is there Dene as well?
Yeah, Dene or northern Saskatchewan.
Okay.
Yeah. So just so people know, Eskimo is a bad word. Don't use it.
Don't use it.
We're using it illustratively here.
Yeah, it's not a word chosen by them. It was a word that they were labeled. They were labeled as eaters of raw meat. It's like calling somebody a spear chucker. Like it's not a word they chose, and it's a drastic simplification and erasure of who they actually are.
And also, it doesn't, you know, like a lot of people explorers who went north wouldn't listen to Inuit and northern peoples. And they're like, oh my gosh, this is disgusting and barbaric. But like, honestly, when you're that far north and there's not enough vegetation, you need all the nutrients you can get. And so by consuming the meat raw or at a much rawer state than what we usually have as cooked meat, you're getting like a lot more like vitamin C and the essential nutrients that you need that gets cooked off by cooking. And so it's a survival technique. It's not, you know, because like, oh, this is the most, well, I guess, you know, when it's your food, maybe it is the tastiest thing, but it's, you know, it's not a sort of a comment on civilization. And in fact, it's the opposite. You know, like these people figured out how to survive with the barest amount of resources and were smart enough to figure it out.
But this is a story of survival and family and lots of blood. Chow time approaches, and I tell you, dear friends, neither words nor pictures are adequate to describe what follows. But if you can imagine this, at the same time both horror movie and heartwarming, a mix of blood-spattered butchery and loving nourishment, a meal like I've never experienced.
Hey, we got Phil. That's an make.
The meal starts off like countless others round the world. A few words of thanks for the food before us. But then, dear viewer, things take a different tack.
I can't wait to eat the bread.
Oh yeah, that's the best part?
Yes.
There's laughter, pride, excitement, like a Thanksgiving dinner. Frequent exclamations of yay and ooh. His dad zips open the belly and collects the blood. Junior grabs for a rib. Grandma cracks open a skull and digs out some brain. And suddenly the room is tearing that thing apart like a meat-filled piñata. Every part a treat.
We're keeping the blood for stews.
The Inuit waste nothing. They use every part of the animal. To make sure I get the full experience, I'm offered a piece of everything.
Anthony.
The liver? A little liver, some kidney. Hey, how about some whisker treat? Not actually eaten per se, more sucked and chewed to extract a tiny nubbit of meat from within the blubber and cartilage.
Oh, that is good. It's like, it tastes like sea urchin roe.
And of course, and it was inevitable really, wasn't it? I'm offered the best part, the eyeball, to be slit and sucked out like a fat Concord grape.
I'll
split it with you. This is an act of pure generosity and kindness to an honored guest.
The families were left without sufficient supplies of food and caribou skins and other materials for making appropriate clothing and tents. As they had been moved about 2,000 kilometers to a very different ecosystem, they were unfamiliar with the wildlife and had to adjust to months of 24-hour darkness during the winter and 24-hour sunlight during the summer, something that does not occur in northern Quebec. Eventually, the Inuit learned the local beluga whale migration routes and were able to survive in the area, hunting over a range of 18,000 square kilometers each year. Royal Canadian Mounted Police reports from the time stated that the two colonies, Resolute and Grise Fiord, were generally successful in terms of morale, housing, and subsistence living. However, these claims are debatable, and no reports were made about the number of Inuit who froze or starved to death during the first winter.
There's similar fake reports about starvation shit and early reserves as well.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah, they'll say that they're doing fine just to save face.
At this time of the year, it's dark all day long at Resolute. The moon provides the only light for the Christmas mail run. Resolute Bay, 700 miles closer to Russia than to Toronto. The temperature during this historic trip of the television film crew, 45 below. In an Air Force snowmobile, the CO takes the camera crew to an Eskimo village and discusses Arctic travel with John Rook of News Magazine.
How far away is this Eskimo camp, Ron?
The camp, John, there's a direct road joining our station to the Eskimo village, and by road it's approximately 5 miles.
RCMP report, Craig Harbor, 1953. All natives, with the exception of one, state being happy and content. Fatty, E9713, complains of not being able to see a long way in all directions from his tent.
If there had been no seals, we would have frozen to death. Thanks to the seals, we were able to eat. We used the seal blubber to make oil for our oil lamps. We would melt the snow with our lamps, wash our clothes. There was no source of fresh water there. When it was very dark, our mothers would fetch ice, and they didn't even have bare essentials like a flashlight. They had brought lamps from Inukjuak, and they would use them to shine on the shore where they looked for ice.
Compared to the hunting back in Inukjuak, it used to be very cold and very dark, and we have been used to hunting in open waters. Now we were in a land that had no open water. We lifted off the seal breathing holes, and when we went to the water edge, it was very dark. We sometimes would wait for hours by a fox turd, thinking it was a seal's breathing hole because it was so dark. After waiting some time for the seal to come up, we would touch the hole and discover that we had touched a fox turd. He would always sigh too and say, they promised we were going back. They promised that we were going to have a steady diet of caribou. His spirit started to slow down when he realized that it was not going to be as they had promised. His spirits fell fast, and he didn't make it throughout the first year.
RCMP report, Craig Harbor, 1954. One death occurred, Fatty, E9713, due to heart attack.
So during the 1980s, the relocated Inuit and their descendants initiated a claim against the Canadian government, arguing that, quote, there is overwhelming evidence to suggest that the central, if not sole, reasons for the relocation of Inuit to the high Arctic was the desire by Canada to assert its sovereignty over the Arctic islands and surrounding area, and in 1987 sought $10 million in compensation from the federal government. So following public and media pressure, the federal government created a program to assist the Inuit return to the south, and in 1989, 40 Inuit returned to a revitalized Port Harrison, leading to a breakup of families along generational lines, as younger community members often chose to remain in the high Arctic. Those who stayed were reported to be fiercely proud of their forced adopted homes. In 1990, the House of Commons of Canada Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs asked the government to apologize to the Inuit who had been moved to the high Arctic in 1953, to provide compensation to them, and to formally recognize the residents of Resolute and Grise Fiord for their service to Canada's sovereignty. In response, the Canadian government of Brian Mulroney commissioned the Hickling Report, which conveniently absolved them of any wrongdoing, arguing that the Inuit had volunteered to be moved and that they had been relocated due to the harsh social and economic conditions in Inukjuak.
They volunteered based on lies, though.
Yeah, you'll have tons and tons of game. Nice houses all ready for you. Just kidding. Fuck off.
Like, if you sign a contract full of fake information, that contract is going to be void later on. Like, it's not a consensual agreement. You don't know all the details. You're being lied to.
And also, your agents are accompanied by RCMP.
No, the agents are RCMP.
Right.
All the agents there were like uniformed RCMP members.
So there's like a bunch of cops. They're like,
a bunch of cops.
Hey, you want to? Let's go sign this. Let's go.
Great plan for you. Like sign the contract, and we'll take you to the best place on earth.
Not threatening at all.
Not threatening at all.
And it seems more like instead of, hey, we're at Resolute, welcome to your new home, it's more like, get off the fucking boat, you know?
Yeah. So the Hickling Report was conveniently written by a longtime government official and was strongly criticized by academics and the media. In contrast, a Canadian Human Rights Commission report submitted in December 1991 argued that there was clear evidence that there were government concerns about Arctic sovereignty at the time of the relocations, and an understanding that the settlements would contribute to Canadian sovereignty. The report concluded that the Government of Canada had broken its promise to return the relocatees to Inukjuak after 2 years if they wished. A further report, written by Trent University professor Magnus Gunther, examined the various claims of academics disputing what had occurred in the relocations. It concluded that the government had acted with humane intentions, and as a result, Tom Siddon, the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, stated that it would be, quote, inappropriate for the government to apologize, end quote, or provide compensation, which I personally think is total bullshit.
Yeah, no kidding.
Mm-hmm. In July 1994, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples held hearings to investigate the relocation program. The Inuit evidence overwhelmingly highlighted that they had been forcibly relocated, while the government officials argued that they had been moved voluntarily. The official who had been in charge of the relocation tried to suggest that witnesses had changed their stories in order to claim compensation, and that the move had been a success. The commission found that the Government of Canada had determined to rehabilitate the Inuit of Port Harrison, weaning them from dependency and moral decline by moving them to better lands with abundant game for hunting, which also smells like bullshit.
Mm-hmm. Just because these people are resilient and they find a way to survive what you do to them does not mean that it was done with good intentions and that it was done in the best manner and that it was done in a humane fashion.
Yep.
No, just the people that survived up there were lucky that they were awesome and smart and knew what they were doing.
Yeah, and to this day, we have no idea how many of those Inuit starved and froze to death in the first winter. Like, there was no record kept of it, and no one acknowledges that it occurred, other than the Inuit who are actually at Resolute and Grise Fiord, who are like, no, we definitely lost members of our family. We lost our children. In my story, Tivia Gulakak lost his life along with 2 of his kids. Like,
yeah,
this is representative of what actually went on. So after nearly 5 decades, an official government apology was given on the 18th of August 2010 to the relocated families for the inhumane treatment and suffering caused by their relocation. John Duncan, the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, stated, quote, "The Government of Canada deeply regrets the mistakes and broken promises of this dark chapter in our history and apologizes for the high Arctic relocation having taken place. We would like to pay tribute to the relocatees for their perseverance and courage. The relocation of Inuit families to the high Arctic is a tragic chapter in Canada's history that we should not forget, but that we must acknowledge, learn from, and teach our children. Acknowledging our shared history allows us to move forward in partnership and in a spirit of reconciliation." End quote. In 2021, Resolute and Grise Fiord had the 2 lowest crime rates in the Nunavut territory and the single lowest unemployment rate in Canada. Both communities host hundreds of scientists and explorers every year, and both receive regular air service to Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut.
Is where they haul our ice, glacier ice from the glacier out here in the bay. And it supplements our water, as I said. We only get 40 liters per person per day, and shortly it'll be going down to 15 liters per person per day. The left portion is the manager's residence, the post office in the bottom, and the manager's residence at the top. There is the nursing station. There's a nurse and her husband and child live there, very small. And we'll just sort of take a little picture of town here. As you can see, we're sort of on a beach here. The mountains, they're about 2,000 feet high. Down in there is the community itself. We're located up at one end, just as you come into town from the airport, or into town. There's only a quarter-mile of road, half a mile at the most. It's the NCPC plant with the generators. That's our water tank, which contains our year's supply of water. And sweeping around here, we're going to get a little sun in us. Actually, it was an RCMP building. It used to be the Special Constable's residence back in the 50s. And back there is the community hall, utilized quite a bit by the children, floor hockey and what have you. The Grise Fiord International Airport. You can see by the sign. You can see there's your limousine service right there. That's our mode of transportation, no police vehicles. Summertime we have a 3-wheel trike, Honda. My fingers tend to get a little cold here at 30 below up at the airport. The aircraft will come in almost straight ahead from the water, which is out to the right there, or ice at this time of year and the other 10 months. That's pretty well it.
That's the high Arctic relocation. What did y'all think?
You know, the usual colonial bullshit that has taken place since the beginning of time in Canada.
Lies.
And then the government, you know,
it's like, oops, sorry.
Goes after the indigenous people and fucks it all up, and then later they say, oops, sorry.
Can you imagine how desperate you would have felt being on the CD Howe, forced basically at gunpoint in these little dinghies to travel to Grise Fiord, where there is fuck all nothing there? No tents, no buildings, no plumbing infrastructure, no electrical infrastructure, no telephones, just a shitty gravel runway with that at the time didn't even have service to Frobisher Bay, which was then Cambridge Bay, which was then renamed Iqaluit after Nunavut became the territory.
Yeah.
They were issued a rifle when they were told they were going to get a house. Like, they're not equivalent in the slightest.
No, and like there's no vegetation there. The wildlife was completely foreign to them because it's like 2,000 kilometers away from northern Quebec, where there was caribou and foxes and shit.
Yeah.
Well, if you think about how cold it gets here, could you just imagine? Like, people are already freezing to death here in Saskatchewan.
Yeah. Minus 48 is their record cold in Grise Fiord. So I'm like, it's fucking freezing.
And that's with no wind.
That's with no wind. And if you don't have animal skins to keep you warm, like, you're fucked. And that's why those people froze to death and starved to death, because they had nothing. So to like try to suggest that it was a humanitarian operation, I don't buy it. I don't buy it at all.
I think it was just the opposite. Some people might want to gravitate towards blaming ignorance, saying like, oh, you know, they're used to cold weather, they'll make it up there. I don't think that's the correct answer. This is the same government that in the past purposely killed off more buffalo than they needed to because they thought that if they killed off the buffalo, that'll finish off the indigenous people.
Yeah.
So I think the cruelty is intended. They knew that many would die when they made the plan. I don't think they're stupid enough to think that relocating them in this area with no structures and no real wildlife, I don't think they thought, oh, it's going to be fine. I think they knew people were going to die, and as long as they had a settlement and a few of them survived, they'd have their claim to the north.
Yeah. Well, two things to add. One is that as a peace offering, they took a few Inuit families from Pond Inlet, which is only a couple 100 kilometers away from Grise Fiord on the northern tip of Baffin Island, and sent them to Grise Fiord to teach the new Inuit there how to hunt and fish and all that shit. But those families that arrived from Pond Inlet fucked off right away as soon as they saw what Grise Fiord was. The second point is that the government of Canada at the time had referred in official documents to the, quote, Eskimo problem, which was that they used to be nomadic, and in Port Harrison, they were living in a settled community, and they wanted to fix the Eskimo problem by making them nomadic again, which is something that they weren't prepared to do because for generations they had lived in Port Harrison and worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. But when the company failed and pulled out, they were left for 2 decades with no employment, and that's why most of them were on welfare.
And I also kind of wonder, like, why didn't they commission some of the more northern communities, more north of the people of Port Harrison, to, you know, create some winterized clothing and things to sort of help create more weatherproof garments for the people that were moving to territories closer? Like, they could have easily...
Because they didn't give a fuck.
Because they didn't give a fuck.
Yeah, they gave no shits.
Yeah, this sounds to me like it's a very like politically minded, short-sighted even.
Yeah, the Inuit there were expendables.
Yeah.
They weren't considered with full humanity.
Yeah, this was political gain for human loss.
Yeah.
Clear and simple.
I couldn't imagine like being on that boat and driving up to that, what I thought was my new home, and the guy tells me to get off the boat, and I'm like, where the fuck's my house?
Yeah.
Well, it's 40 below. Where am I? I didn't bring enough clothing to live outside full time.
Yeah,
you said there would be a house here.
Resolute had an Air Force base on Cornwallis Island. But when the Inuit basically went and knocked on the door of the Air Force Base and said, "You got any food?" they were met with rifle butts and basically told, "Fuck off back to your community," the community that physically didn't exist.
Yeah.
Could you imagine being one of the people from Pond Inlet?
Which is in the high Arctic itself.
Right. So you're forced from your community to go help these people.
Yeah, and they were forced.
And you get there and you're like, fuck, if I stay here, I'm going to die.
Yeah.
And you find a way to get yourself away.
Yeah, and it was only 4 families from Pond Inlet, but like they literally fucked off as soon as they got there because they're like, "There's nothing here. These people are going to die." This shit.
Well, they probably want to save themselves and save each other before they can save people they don't know.
Yeah.
Pond Inlet is about 500 clicks south of Grise Fiord. It's like a whole island over. You can start to see green where the people from Pond Inlet are from. They're only 1,000 clicks from Inuktjuak, which is like a southern northern community. Northern community, that's southish.
And natural communities form around resources, around animal migration routes and places where you can grow things and sources of fresh water. You can't just plop somebody wherever is politically expedient for you and expect them to survive, you know?
Yeah, and to describe the location of these communities, Resolute is the 4th most northern community in Canada. Grise Fiord is the 3rd most northern community in Canada. Eureka, which is basically just a weather station, is the 2nd most northern community in Canada. And Alert, which is at the very, very tip of Canada, is the most northern permanently inhabited place on Earth, and it is an Air Force base.
What is the purpose of CFS Alert and the Canadian Forces here? Why are you here?
So obviously part of our biggest mission is to maintain a northern sovereign Arctic outpost in support of all of Government Canada initiatives.
And obviously signal intelligence is something, that's why it originally started in the 50s?
That's right, yeah. Around mid-50s, 1957, 1958. This started as a signals intelligence, a wireless station, and it kind of evolved from there.
Why here? What's so special about here? I mean, it just seems crazy that you have to bring everything here.
Well, it's certainly a very strategic location up here. We're certainly at the northern edge of the Canadian geography. When you talk about progressing Arctic sovereignty, this is pretty much your ideal location.
Unbelievable. The tundra, there's no trees, I guess is the most shocking part. It's a desert, ultimately, here.
It is. We have very, very little snowfall throughout the year, and ultimately this is considered an Arctic desert up here.
There is water around us?
The Arctic Ocean, just off to, probably just a kilometer away from here.
Now, boats, do they bring anything in?
Not usually. This is a very difficult place to access by sea. So typically what we'll do is we'll bring everything in via air, so air transport. Mostly through CC-130 Hercules.
Unbelievable. What about wildlife here?
There's a lot of wildlife. Obviously, we have everything from polar bears to Arctic wolves, Arctic hares, muskox, a lot of different types of wildlife up here.
We are here right now, and it's 24 hours of daylight.
That's great.
It's very nice. It's bright. It's sunny. It's cold. I'm not going to lie. It's very, very dry, and it's very cold. But obviously, when it's darkness, 24 hours of darkness, that has got to be mentally the most challenging part of being up here.
It is indeed, and that actually stretches over about a 4 to 5 month period of complete darkness. And that's certainly something that we're very cognizant of, very aware of. And we try to make sure that there's enough activities during off-duty times to allow people to have an opportunity to get out some energy, because it is difficult. You're in that constant state almost of fatigue. And so you have to be able to find a way to get rid of your energy, make sure that you're able to sleep during normal sleep hours, and maintain a normal sleep pattern.
What is the parallel on the Grise Fiord in terms of coordinates?
I will know in just a second.
Okay,
I
guys,
wonder how many millions of dollars went into establishing the Air Force Base. That's
probably a lot.
Yeah.
76th parallel. Yeah, 76th parallel. Of course, North Pole being 90.
Yeah.
So it's up there.
Yeah.
It's up there.
It's amazing how much of Canada is just like way the fuck up there. Like when people picture Canada, like the major cities, the major population centers, it's all in pretty much the bottom third. The top 2/3 are thousands of miles of tundra where people live hundreds of kilometers apart.
Grise Fjord's at the 76th parallel. Saskatoon, where the podcast is hosted, is somewhere around the 52nd parallel. Let's say San Francisco is on the 37th parallel. So if you're good with maps, that'll give you an idea just how the far fuck up there it is.
So before we end the episode, does anyone want to change their rating of the wine now that you've polished it off?
Wine out of wine.
Yeah,
I'll give wine.
Yeah, I'll give it a 6 out of 10. It's
despite
pretty
it
good.
being despite it being a decade old and homemade, it ended up not being spoiled.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's impressive.
It was
ended up
legit
not being
wine.
spoiled.
Yeah.
It definitely gave me some like sucker face, like lemon head kind of sucker face.
Your faces have been hilarious.
Towards the bottom of the glass, it only got more sour.
Next episode, we're doing a pirate drink, so it's gonna be good.
Okay.
It tastes a lot better when I'm not freezing to death in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Okay, folks, for Occultae Veritatis podcast, my name is Leon Filger, along with
Sage Murray,
Richard Bigley,
Ood Gallifrey,
the soundboard demon,
and joining us in studio,
Don Kessler,
Panda.
LEB.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night. We'll see you next time.
Love you. Bye.
And much respect to the peoples who live up north.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here is an example of traditional Inuit throat singing. This is the song Katajjaq from Hudson's Bay. Enjoy and see you in the after show. Alrighty, this after show is going to be just a preview of something I'm going to cook up later this year, and especially since I want to see the outcomes of this lawsuit. This is an update to our Onision episodes. Long story short, Onision is this early YouTube star that broke out with a meme banana dance video and used his fame to groom young fans into being his partners. And for a long time, he seemingly got away with a lot of this. He hasn't been brought to justice. He's been deplatformed off YouTube. He's had his Patreon shut down. He's been scared out of a bunch of internet communities for being a teenaging, pursuing, grooming, abusive creep, but he's still around in bips and bops. He's on Twitter. He puts videos out on alternative sites. He runs an OnlyFans, blah, 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 blah. He runs a website. He's still around. But a lawsuit has been filed against him, pursuing him for the very thing he has not been brought to justice for yet, coercion and grooming. Now, we don't know the outcomes of this lawsuit. We don't know what the prosecution is going to present. We don't know how strong it is yet. Details are very scarce at this point, but I'm going to cross my fingers and hope that he's finally brought to justice. But until later this year, when we get the little results of the trial, and I'm able to cover the Onision update in one big episode, where I tell everything that he's done since the end of our last episode a couple years back, we can just celebrate the fact that this man, at least, has a lawsuit against him, and hope for justice in the future. Alrighty, I'll see you guys next week for some more interesting bullshit. This has been Occultae Veritatis, coming at you in 2023. Love you, and bye-bye.